Hello everyone, this is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. Today we're looking at the top 10 budget decks for the current standard format. Let's get straight into it. First of all, looking at some staple cards that pretty much every deck needs right now. I would say that a playset is 4 copies of one card. That's the maximum amount of copies that you can play in Pokemon of any individual card. So when you're seeing the prices there for Cynthia and Guzma, I'm talking about getting 4 copies of one card. And these are cards that you will often see as 4-ofs in decks, just because the majority of decks use them to get set up in the initial stages. Cynthia's and Lily's always drawing you cards. Guzma's being a critical card for accessing your opponent's bench Pokemon to take knockouts on them and deal with big threats. The Ball Search cards to get your Pokemon rolling. Switches, Escape Ropes, Rescue Stretchers. These are all key cards that you'll see over and over again as you start researching the game. These cards will become commonplace to see all the time because they're pretty necessary for how our current format works for getting your decks rolling. So if you are thinking about building decks in general, these are some staple cards that would be good to pick up. Even if you're thinking of only buying like one deck, these will be cards that you want to grab in play sets of, just because it can help you adapt into other decks into the future. Now, is it a good time to get involved in the Pokemon trading card game? Well, previously, Tapu Lele GX was sort of the biggest reason why it was expensive to play this game. Obviously, comparative to other trading card games, Pokemon is still very, very cheap. But Tapu Lele GX used to be far more expensive because it's so important to give your deck so many more outs into a turn 1 supporter card so that you don't end up dead drawing. This card was like sometimes a 2 or 3 counter decks. Now it's more of a one-of copy, just because we've had a slight increase in the amount of physical supporter cards we have options to play with, like Erica's Hospitality, Bill's Analysis, even things like Copycat is a nice budget supporter card that you can play. So nowadays you can get away with just one copy of Tapu Lele in some decks, and it's much less expensive because there's also been a promo release of the Tapu Lele GX. So some of these decks that I'll mention today will expect to play one copy of Tapu Lele, but they don't have to initially, and at the same time, one copy is pretty much all you need these days, so that's something to bear in mind. Also, the way the meta currently is, in the Sun and Moon to Team Up meta at least, at time of recording, there are really only a big 5 decks dominating. That's kind of like Zoroark decks, Pikachu and Zekrom decks, Zapdos decks, Malamar decks, and Blacephalon. There's like a big 5 right now in terms of decks, and that's quite narrow as a format goes for a trading card game. So it's actually quite easy to try and dig out some anti-meta style decks, and they may be slightly cheaper as well. Some of the things on this list are anti-meta in nature, but that does not mean that they're weak decks in general. It just means that right now they might see more success than maybe in 3 months' time when the Unbroken Bonds, the Double Blaze set as it's called in English, comes on shelves. So right now it might be a good idea to look at some of these budget decks because you could immediately start looking to get points with them if you just run into a good number of matchups in a tournament. So it's a good time to pick an anti-meta deck in the game. So how have I made this top 10 list? What's sort of been on my criteria? I've really tried to break it down into these 4 things. Playability, obviously how good is it going to be in a competitive environment? Price, obviously all of these are trying to be budget, but just how affordable are these? Are there going to be some standout cards that you need to purchase? Is a Tapu Lele definitely required in the deck or not? And how easy is it to branch out or improve a build with further investment? So if you enter the game with a budget deck, start enjoying Pokemon a lot more, how easy is it to adapt the decks that you've already built to becoming, an even better fine-tuned deck list? Will there be room to grow, or will you have to start again from scratch? And also we'll think about how much investment it needs from like newer cards as well. That kind of moves into longevity quite nicely. How long will the deck remain relevant for? Is it one of these anti-meta decks that is currently only working because it targets 1 or 2 matchups? Are there any new cards that it can gain from Double Blaze in 3 months' time? Are May set that can help the deck that, again, you can reinvest into to improve your deck? And also we have to keep an eye on rotation. There's nothing announced officially for rotation, but it usually occurs at the end of Worlds, which is, around September time when the new format sort of comes into play. So that's something to bear in mind. Will any of these cards, are they early Sun and Moon sets or are they late Sun and Moon sets is essentially what I'm saying, without being too clear on saying I'm expecting it to be, like Shining Legends On, for example, which many people expect. I'm not going to completely flat line say that, but I'll say if there are some, early Sun and Moon set cards that are likely to rotate, I will mention it in this video. Also, beginner friendliness is obviously a big one. Obviously, there are going to be players watching this that are seasoned veterans of Pokemon. It's just maybe they've left the game and come back, or even if they are still currently playing, they're always looking to save the pennies rather than just fork out on the brand new decks. So there'll be people who already know decks inside and out and how to play the game, but I'm also trying to cater this video to newer players, of course, because where else to start than to sort of dip the toe into into the game and just start with a budget deck and see how you like it, so you're not fully committed with buying, top of the range deck immediately and then feeling that you've sunk a bunch of money and then don't like the game. So I've tried to look at some archetypes that are relatively easy to pick up and learn. Does it teach you fundamentals of the game so that you can improve as a player as well as you go? And can these sort of skills that you pick up with the deck itself be applied to decks in the future as well? So I've tried to incorporate that into my thought process as well whilst making this top 10 list. So let's start off with number 10, and it's going to be SYLVEON Mill. As you can see, I've done a quick little category rating for the 4 things that I've just outlined here. SYLVEON's pretty playable right now. It actually got 2 top 32 placements in Collinsville. It's essentially trying to capitalize on Zoroark players and some Zapdos-based players as well, because they're fairly easy to out-resource. This archetype is trying to mill the opponent. It's not trying to take prize cards. It is simply trying to loop the Lusamine supporter to grab lots of stalling cards back. So that's kind of the main aspect of this deck. You're constantly using its attack Magical Ribbon to search your deck for 3 cards. Usually these are cards to react to your opponent's board, removing energy cards, healing your own SYLVEON over and over again, and accumulating this Lusamine combo. That is the whole idea behind the SYLVEON deck. It's pretty cheap overall. I mean, you're going to play 3 copies of SYLVEON GX, which is, like a $6 or $7 card right now, and you only need 3 copies. So that's not too bad in general. All these star ratings are out of 5, by the way. And at the same time, the sort of reason why this is slightly awkward is because you're buying mill cards. You're buying hammers to get rid of energy cards. You're getting loads of healing cards. You're getting loads of specific supporters that are only good in a deck like SYLVEON or like another mill deck that we might mention later on today. So you really don't have much wiggle room. If you start with SYLVEON and don't like it, you've got to start a whole new deck again and buy all the other cards. So that's the only awkward thing for SYLVEON in terms of price. For longevity, I think this is reasonable. Obviously, SYLVEON's from Guardians Rising, so it's a likely contender to rotate at the end of the season. But at the same time, looking in the more recent future, as Double Blaze comes out, there are also some great Fairy Charm cards coming in that set, which can allow SYLVEON to wall even more archetypes and give it stronger matchups potentially. So that's something to keep an eye on for SYLVEON. It may have some reasonable longevity, at least to the end of the season. The big thing that I'm against here is beginner friendliness. It's not an easy deck to pick up and play because you have to know the meta very well. You need to know what your opponent's decks are always capable of. You need to know general energy counts and what other counts they have of like switching cards, Guzmas and stuff that you would expect in most people's decks in order to go about creating a game plan with your SYLVEON and how you're going to run them out of resources. And essentially, because you are cherry picking from your deck with this Magical Ribbon attack, making mistakes is very costly, and it will literally lose you the game if you don't make the correct decisions. So it will only teach you how to play mill and not teach you the fundamentals of, prize trading, resource management, all that stuff. It's more just trying to out-resource the opponent and make sure that they run out of their own stuff. So you're really learning a very small aspect of the game rather than the more general aspect of the game, which is usually winning prize races, which is the main way that people win in the TCG. So I think it's not a great deck for a pick up and play kind of approach. If it's your first Pokemon deck, I think SYLVEON Mill is not necessarily the one for you. Moving on to number 9, we have Tool Drop. Tool Drop is all based around this Doublade attacker that for a double colorless energy does 30 for each tool card attached to all Pokemon. That's yours and your opponent's. So in the format right now, there's a lot of Jirachi-based builds, which always use skateboards. There's a lot of Choice Band being played in the format as well. And we are, of course, going to kit out our own deck with a bunch of tools as well. And in terms of playability, it's not super high right now. We're a non-GX deck that's slightly slower than Zapdos. That's the biggest reason why the Tool Drop archetype hasn't really kicked off too much. At the same time, because you do have to kit out your deck with so many tool cards, it's also a little bit awkward for you because sometimes you can get into these hands of just non-playable cards, and you have to like shuffle it all back in, and you've not been able to attach all these, and it can be a little awkward here and there. I think price-wise, the deck is very efficient. You just can kit out your deck with a bunch of ball search cards and also adventure bags and a bunch of tools if you want to go down a heavy budget line. Also, with further investment, you could start incorporating 1 or 2 copies of Jirachi, obviously one of the more expensive Pokemon right now in the game. But if you do want to, go further down the line with this deck, you can definitely add more investment into it as well. So something to bear in mind. Also, there's a Duskstone coming in the next set, which can help you evolve into a Chandelure, which gives you a lot more hit points as well. Or not Chandelure, what am I talking about? An Aegislash. So that could also be good for the longevity aspect of this deck. At the same time, Doublade is from Team Up and Genesect is from Lost Thunder, so the core of the deck is going to stay even in the next year. So it's going to definitely stay in rotation 100%, I would say. At least the very core. Maybe a tool here and there might rotate, but there are always other ones that you can add into your deck list, so something to bear in mind. At the same time, in terms of longevity, a big deck that might be coming out from Double Blaze is going to be a Gardevoir and Sylveon Tag Team GX deck. So having a metal deck to answer that is also something definitely strong to bear in mind. You could end up becoming an anti-meta deck in 3 months' time. So if you spend the next 1 or 2 months accumulating this deck, starting to learn how to play, by the time Double Blaze comes out, you just fall into a much better meta. So for longevity, this definitely gets a big thumbs up from me. It's maybe not in the best place in the metagame immediately right now, but it might get a lot stronger, so do bear that in mind. And for beginner friendliness, this is perfect, I think. Not too difficult to play. You have a very linear strategy. Basically flood the board of tools whenever possible and chain attackers with Doublade. That's pretty much the idea, and it's not too difficult to pick up and learn. It'll teach you some good resource management techniques as well, because you're limited to 4 double colorless energies, and you'll have to try and use some other cheeky plays with like counter gain or EXP share to maintain attackers with your Doublade. It's also going to help you recycle Pokemon all the time. It'll be a constant learning experience with Tool Drop as well. So I think there's a lot of context that you can learn from Doublade that I think is really worth it in Tool Drop. So that's, again, kind of a thumbs up from me, just because I think it's not too playable right now, but it might get stronger in the future. And until until Double Blaze comes out, you can be learning the game in general, which is pretty good. On to Lost March. This is an archetype that, as Team Up first came out, people thought were very, very playable. But as the meta has developed, Ultra Necrozma, Malamar has become very popular, as has Zapdos and Jolteon-based builds. These are all trouble for Lost March. So it's not in the best metagame position right now either, similar to the Tool Drop deck. But at the same time, it has some good inherent power behind it, because it's a non-GX deck that can eventually hit very, very hard. The concept of Lost March is simply getting lots of Pokemon into your Lost Zone, and that's via the likes of your Skiploom's ability, which puts itself and its own Hoppip into the Lost Zone. The Trumbeaks can Mountain Pass with its ability to get straight into the Lost Zone. There's also a Lost Blender item that can put any Pokemon, or any cards actually, into the Lost Zone themselves. So using all of those things in your deck will accumulate this damage to make these 1 energy attackers, the Jumpluff and the Natu, very, very powerful. So in a vacuum, this deck is good. You just have to dodge a couple of awkward matchups in the metagame right now. Jumpluff isn't the cheapest of holographic cards because Lost Thunder is such a large set, but at the very least it is a League promo, so that will definitely put down the price. And another good thing about the deck is it's all from Lost Thunder. You can see all these 3 cards, so it's unlikely to rotate. It'll stick around for a year or so. And as I said, the strategy is linear. Dump things into the Lost Zone and try and hit for big damage. So this is, again, an easy, beginner-friendly pick-up-and-play deck that's going to last a long time. So although it's not the most powerful in the world, it's going to be relatively consistent at what it does every single game, and it's not going anywhere for a long time. And it's, again, one of these decks that you can give a friend if they've just started out the game, get their head around it after, a week or so, and they'll play at a reasonable level of skill. And that's also just a real good nod to this deck right now. Next up, we have VIKA BULU. This is combining Vikavolt, the Stage 2, using Strong Charge to attach onto some of these GX Pokemon. Most notably, Tapu Bulu GX can use its Nature's Judgment attack to do 180 damage. If you have a choice band on top of that, that's hitting a golden number in the TCG right now, which is 210 to knock out Zoroarks. Also, its grass typing is good for dealing with Lycanroc, which is another very important GX Pokemon in the game right now. So essentially, we're trying to be a big beat stick deck with this Tapu Bulu. And we also have a Tapu Koko GX option in the deck as well to help out against some Pikachu Zekrom tag team GX decks. So this combination, even though it is fairly GX heavy, both of these GXs are promos, so they're not that expensive at all. And I think this can be a reasonable deck right now in the metagame of being a good Zoro smasher, whilst also being a tanky deck against the likes of Zapdos. Tapu Bulu is very tanky. Its own GX attack can fully heal itself as well. So if you kit out your deck to have a high count of choice bands for Zoroark and a decent count of stadium cards like Aether Paradise Conservation Area, you can be quite tanky in those matchups and present an awkward deck for those two big decks in the format right now, which is a pretty good deal for you. In terms of price, it's not the cheapest on the bunch here. As I mentioned, there are some GXs. Even if they are cheap, they're still going to be like $3-4 each. You probably need 3 Tapu Bulus, 1 Tapu Koko, and you would definitely need 1 Tapu Lele GX in this deck as well. Whereas some of the ones previously I mentioned, actually all the ones previously until now, don't require Tapu Lele GX, although Tool Drop might want to play 1. VIKA Bulu probably needs to play 1 because it wants to try and get Lily on turn 1 to hit some Nest Balls, because you're going to use this Vikavolt as a stage 2 Pokemon, and missing the Grubbins in the early turns is very detrimental to you. So guaranteeing a turn 1 support is a big deal in this deck. Obviously, it's a big deal in every deck, but these other builds, like SYLVEON doesn't really play Tapu Lele ever. Tool Drop and Lost March normally rely on the likes of Let Loose, Marshadow, and Oranguru, and they're normally one-offs in those decks. So the Tapu Lele would be a small investment for this, which is definitely something to bear in mind. A number of cards will likely rotate as well, which is awkward. The Vikavolt is from Sun and Moon base set. We obviously have no idea where the cutoff will be for the Sun and Moon promos, but these are early ones, so that's something to bear in mind. But in terms of beginner friendliness, this also ticks some boxes. You are trying to be a big one-hit KO smashing deck, and that's not too hard to learn, really, because you just need to build up powerful attackers and accumulate one-shots. That's pretty much the whole idea around Vikavolt Tapu Bulu. Next up, we have our other stalling variant right now in the game. HOOPA, Regigigas, Walls, whatever you want to call it. Basically, similar to the SYLVEON, you're not trying to take prizes with this deck. You're just trying to throw awkward Pokemon into the active position that your opponent can't deal with. And over time, you will use this Lusamine loop to infinitely out-resource the opponent by removing all their energy cards or just removing their deck in total. In terms of playability, this is definitely up there. It got a second place in a recent special event in France. And in terms of affordability, because you definitely don't need Tapu Lele, you don't even need the likes of Cynthia's or Lily's, so your budget's going to be fairly cheap, which is good. The one awkward thing, similar to the SYLVEON deck, though, is that you're going to be committing to cards that are only very good in a mill deck. Things like 4 copies of Bill's Analysis, looking at getting like Wondrous Labyrinth, the Stadium card, getting a lot of Hammers and Max Potions and stuff like that. These are all cards that are only helpful in sort of walling archetypes, and they don't really translate over into more normal decks overall. So that's the only reason why the price rating isn't much higher. In terms of longevity, I feel like Mill is going to be powerful as long as Lusamine's around, so that's something to keep an eye out for. And we do have a lot of milling tools right now in the metagame, so I think it's reasonable that it's going to stick around for at least the rest of the season, because Zoroark and Zapdos are going to continue to be strong decks. In terms of beginner friendliness, similar to SYLVEON, you're learning how to mill people rather than win games, so the fundamentals that you learn in this deck are completely different to the fundamentals that you learn with every other deck, so it's not really that good for beginners overall, and that's why it doesn't finish higher on the list, despite being very playable right now in the TCG. In at number 5, we have GRANBULL. This again has a very high playability rating. It's actually a very difficult deck to play with a very high skill cap, but if you do master a GRANBULL, it is one of the most powerful decks possible in the format, budget or otherwise. Obviously, right now, the reason why we're not seeing a huge amount of play for GRANBULL is because of the amount of Alolan Muck being played in Zoroark decks specifically. Also, Alolan Muck has found its way into Blacephalon and a few others here and there, and that really is a little bit poisonous for GRANBULL because it is so reliant on a combination of Instruct and Smooth Over in the deck. The way you play GRANBULL is using its all-out attack for 1 fairy energy. You do 30 damage plus 130 more if you have no cards in your hand. Now this sounds like suicide in a trading card game. Usually hand advantage is the way you win. But when you have Smooth Over and Instruct as a combination, you can force your hand down to 0 on most turns, whilst already having the answers the following turn to get back down to 0 cards, at the same time, you know, replenishing a new GRANBULL if it gets knocked out. So this is a very specific and difficult deck to play. That's why it's not very good for beginners, but it will teach you so much about the game. If you put time into GRANBULL, you will become a far better player, because the way that you read board states, the way that you read the game, the way that you try and accumulate a prize trade, the way that you try and sequence specifically, these are all amazing, amazing tools that you learn with GRANBULL. It really is. If you want to get better at the game, playing GRANBULL is definitely the best way to do it right now in the card game, because winning with the deck is very, very rewarding, and it requires constant focus on every single turn of the game. So in terms of playability, it's powerful. Put in the right hands, it's very poor if you don't have a lot of time behind it. So that's both a blessing and a curse for this deck. Not easy for beginners, but if you want to give yourself a challenge, GRANBULL's definitely a good deck to pick up. In terms of price, it's relatively efficient. You don't need Lele or anything. Maybe a couple of Oranguru, a couple of Magcargo, and a couple of GRANBULL. These won't set you back too far. And one slight issue in terms of longevity is that Oranguru is likely to rotate, as it is a Sun and Moon base set card. So that's the only thing that I can give negative points for it in terms of longevity. I think the only other question mark is how long Alolan Muck stays relevant for. Alolan Muck is also a card that rotates in Sun and Moon, so maybe we can have an alternative to Oranguru in future GRANBULL deck lists, because the Magcargo and the GRANBULL are likely to stick around for longer. So if we can try and build a deck list that can do similar things to Instructing each turn, then we can find a way to build a new GRANBULL in the future, but that's something for a future discussion, really. So yeah, right now, probably the most difficult to play on the list, but also a deck that if you can wrap your head around, you'll become an absolute master, not only of this deck, but also of the game in general when you pick up other decks in the future. So that's got a real big nod to that deck for that reason. In at number 4, we have ALOLAN EXEGGUTOR. This has actually seen a lot of recent play in, again, that France special event and a few local League Cups in the UK right now. This deck is actually seeing a lot of attention, and I think it's reasonable as well in terms of playability. It's had a few top cuts here and there in small cups, and it's sort of being grafted as we speak right now. So this is a real hot take on the deck, really. It's still in the early stages, but there's definitely some power behind this deck, just because ALOLAN EXEGGUTOR is a 160 hit point stage 1 Pokemon, very difficult to get knocked out, and it can win prize trades just because you're going for constant 2-hit KOs with Tropical Shake, each turn, and your opponent has no option but to 2-hit KO your non-GX, and that means you'll be winning a prized race against GXs, and most likely Tropical Shake is one-shotting other non-GX decks, so that's the idea here. One great thing about the team-up ALOLAN EXEGGUTOR that we get on offer here is that it is searchable via a item card called Mysterious Treasure, and that gives us a big consistency boost for helping us find a Tapu Lele turn 1 or a Marshadow turn 1. Even if you don't want to fit a Lele into your deck, you could still have Marshadow, the sort of cheaper alternative to Tapu Lele, to get yourself early searchability and give you a fresh hand at the very least, as well as disrupting the opponent. In terms of price, I think it is relatively inexpensive. Oranguru and Marshadow is probably recommended. A Tapu Lele is also kind of recommended, not guaranteed in the deck list, but it would help your consistency issues. In terms of longevity, the Shuckle and the ALOLAN EXEGGUTOR will not rotate, nor will the Executes, so that's all you really need right now, because that is basically the core of the deck. And obviously basic energies aren't going anywhere, so that's all good. And this is, again, really beginner-friendly, very easy deck to play. You just use Shuckle and the likes of Acrobikes and Viridian Forest to discard a bunch of individual energy into your discard pile so that your Tropical Shake is doing good damage. You're pretty much just going to be going for 2-hit KOs and hoping that ALOLAN EXEGGUTOR can tank enough turns to win you the game and draw the game out long enough that you eventually get this value in prize trade. The deck is pretty simple to play, in my opinion, and that's, again, something that can teach good habits to newer players, so definitely one to keep an eye out for those newer players out there. In at number 3, we have UMBREON WEAVILE. For playability, I really like this as an anti-meta deck. It's going to crush Zoroark players because you are using type coverage with your Buzzwole, as well as WEAVILE, which has the Evil Admonition attack, which has 50 times each of your opponent's Pokemon that has an ability. So Zoroark decks are full of abilities all the time, so WEAVILE and Buzzwole both can take one-hit knockouts on those GXs for just 1 energy. Very, very easy to achieve. So if you want a Zoroark smasher, UMBREON WEAVILE is a pretty good option for that overall. It's also pretty inexpensive. Again, something like a Rangaroo is pretty much the only draw engine this deck looks at playing. And it's just going to try and use the likes of UMBREON to have a steady flow of attackers throughout the game. Pretty simple stuff. I think the only reason I don't give it much longevity is because it's an anti-meta deck right now. It's pretty much good because it beats one of the most popular decks in the game and has ways of beating the likes of Malamar, and it can beat Zapdos potentially if you have Rule of Evil WEAVILE in your deck as well as the Evil Admonition one, which isn't on the screen right now, but it's a card that you can look up. Because Rule of Evil gives you a good option against Malamar. You can take multiple knockouts all at once, and you can try and do the same thing and catch up against Zapdos players with that regard. Also, of course, you have Black Market Prism Star to slow down Zapdos and other non-GX decks as well. So that's something you can bear in mind. So for longevity, I'm skeptical just because if Double Blaze shakes up the meta and Zoroark gets less played or whatever, this deck may be a lot weaker. But you can also adapt it to the meta as well. So I think that's something to bear in mind. Maybe I was a little harsh on the longevity aspect here because a good number of these cards are likely to remain, I would say. But yeah, I think for beginner friendliness, this is pretty reasonable. UMBREON is just going to retaliate on turns when you've taken or received knockouts. Using your Sledgehammer turn is something good to sort of negotiate and learn around. But in general, you still have reading board state and learning prize trade. These are the things you can pick up from UMBREON WEAVILE. So pretty good if you just want to beat Zoroark, which is definitely something a lot of people want to do in the metagame in general right now. People may look at this deck as an anti-meta deck, be it budget or not. People might be playing it anyway just because it can beat Zoroark, and that's a really good thing. In at number 2, we have LAPRAS QUAGSIRE. This is a deck that came just short of top 64 in a recent Collinsville regional. So it's definitely a deck that has reasonable power behind it. In terms of playability, we're not seeing a huge amount of it. But I think seeing that top 64, or it got 65th in Collinsville, gives me some hope for it. However, I think if we go straight down to the longevity and the beginner friendliness, I'm ecstatic about this deck. Double Blaze is a set which is coming out in 3 months' time, and the most promising cards are all fire types. That means, similar to Tool Drop, you're hoping to capitalize on these brand new decks coming out, seeing a lot of play, and you're just going to hit them at a perfect storm, becoming an anti-meta deck in your own right because you love facing fire stuff. That's something that I really do enjoy about LAPRAS QUAGSIRE. You can just fall, the meta can fall into your hands in 3 months' time. So if you, again, start learning the game in the next 3 months, pick these cards up as you go, by the time Double Blaze is out, you could be, pretty good at the game, and you can be hitting lots of good matchups for you, which is awesome. In terms of beginner friendliness, you learn a lot about sequencing with this deck because we have Aqua Patches, Jet Geyser, Washout, all of these things that we can navigate. Also, you know a lot about board state because you're trying to make sure you always have a Quagsire on your field. You want to make sure you have a lot of energy to retain throughout the game as well, with the likes of EXP Share and Aqua Patch once again. So there's a lot of complexity to this deck, but it's still simple enough because the goal is always have lots of water energy in play so that you can keep attacking. It's just navigating those turns to make it as likely as possible to have these energies on board. Because at the end of the day, this is still a combo deck. You're trying to get Aqua Patches working by throwing waters into the discard pile, then accelerating energy, then washing them all out into your active to get these attacks off. So it'll teach you a lot. It may be awkward for the first 2 or 3 weeks while you learn this deck, but once it starts clicking, you will have a lot of good knowledge from it as well. The one thing on price is a little bit awkward. I mean, Lapras is a GX in its own right. Again, one of these cheaper ones similar to VIKA BULU, but I wouldn't be caught dead without one Tapu Lele in this deck, and I would probably play a Rangaroo as well, so these are things to bear in mind. In terms of plus size for the price, you can look at adapting this build quite easily. New water support might be coming out. Also, there's the likes of Magikarp and Warlord tag team. There's a Quagnag base build you can try and go for. There's Articuno as well that you can try and go for. These are all options for the QUAGSIRE deck. So if you just start with the early investment of a few Lapras and thin QUAGSIRE line, you can then look at these other water options for you and see if you do enjoy the game, you can start looking at new cards to add into your water deck. That's pretty much the idea. Finally, we get to number 1, and it's going to be a non-GX based Malamar deck. Malamar right now is a very, very playable archetype. It's a strong deck in general, and in the, outside of the budget world where people are playing Ultra Necrozma, it's, one of those top 5 decks. Simply put, it's one of the best decks in the game, period. And being a non-GX based build of Malamar can have its own perks. Onyx is a big card in the metagame right now because it can hit for weakness on Pikachu and Zekrom Tag Team GX as well as Zoroark. So having some big up trade potential is huge, and having lots of bulky non-GX Pokemon like the Giratina and the Onyx is very frustrating for Zapdos players as well. So in general, this is a very reasonable deck. Obviously, us not having the Ultra Necrozma in the build will make our Zapdos matchups slightly more difficult, as well as mirror matches more difficult. But it means that in terms of price, if we want to start off small with just one Giratina and a couple of Onyx in our deck, and then just have the Malamars, it means that it's going to be pretty cheap. And if we enjoy the game, we can invest into looking at, a second copy of Giratina, a couple copies of Ultra Necrozma, and then suddenly you've got one of the top tier decks in the game right now, which is absolutely incredible. In terms of longevity, Malamar is likely to stay. Giratina is a new card. Onyx is from Lost Thunder as well. So it looks like a lot of this stuff is likely to not rotate. And Psychic Recharge is just one of these abilities that will never not be good. Energy Acceleration in the Pokemon trading card game has always led to decks being successful. So that just means no matter what the meta, this is always going to be, in a vacuum, a strong deck, and that creates decks being good in general, just because if people aren't keeping an eye on this deck, it could just go out of control. So it's always going to be relevant. Since Malamar's release, it's always been a relevant archetype, and right now a non-GX build makes sense in a budget style, especially because of this Onyx. It all becomes pretty reasonable. And again, for beginner friendliness, it's going to teach you a lot about planning turns ahead because of how your Psychic Recharges will go. What's your next attacker next turn? Do I need to start putting energies on things just to retreat them out? How many energies can I get into the discard pile? That's a bit of sequencing as well. Using all your ball search cards, what you can and can't get rid of, and all that good stuff is something to bear in mind. Also, looking at board states all the time. That's a big factor about Malamar. How many do you need on the field? And all that good stuff. So bench management as well is a great thing to learn in the Malamar decks because it is very setup focused. So these are all skills you can acquire from Malamar, and it's not all that difficult to learn over, again, just a number of weeks or months because it is linear in its approach. You're against anything trying to get out Malamars as much as possible just so that you can attach energies and do big hits. That's pretty much the idea. With a non-GX build, you could consider Shrine of Punishment, but that's quite expensive. So I imagine it would just be like some choice bands in the deck list as well, by the way. Just, I thought I'd mention that right now. But yeah, that's going to be the final deck on my top 10 list. I hope you did enjoy this little discussion. If you want to hear any more about some of these archetypes, I have profiled a number of them on the YouTube channel if you want to search for the likes of GRANBULL, UMBREON, WEAVILE, MALAMAR, VIKA, BULU, Lost March. They'll be on the channel for you as well. So do bear that in mind. If you're thinking about specifics, get them in a comment down below and I'll try and get back to you with some answers. But that's it, guys. Thank you so much for watching. Do you agree with this top 10 list? Is there a deck that you've been looking at that's on a budget that I've missed? Let me hear it all down below. And let me know if you're looking at some of these archetypes from the top tier stuff, how you can save some pennies, where you can make these cuts, and where you can have some pseudo replacements for cheaper options right now. I'd love to hear it all down below, and I will get involved in the discussion. So good luck to you guys. If you are going to start building decks, I do implore you to play the trading card game. It's something that's pretty much taken over my life for like 11 years now or something. So I've been playing a long time. And yeah, thanks so much for watching, guys. Hope you did enjoy, and I'll see you in another video soon. Cheers.